Folks, if you've listened to the Heard Tell program, you've heard our friend Gabriella Hoffman, but you need to make sure you're checking out her podcast, District of Conservation. It's a podcast exploring the nuances of true conservation efforts from DC and beyond. From topic discussions to exclusive interviews with conservation and energy newsmakers, Gabriella keeps listeners appraised of the latest news stories while elevating important voices. Listen to the District of Conservation on Apple Podcasts or wherever podcasts are played.
This is the story of the one. As a maintenance engineer, he hears things differently. To the untrained ear, everything on his shop floor might sound fine, but he can hear gears grinding or a belt slipping. So he steps in to fix the problem at hand before it gets out of hand. And he knows Grainger's got the right product he needs to get the job done, which is music to his ears. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Thanks for being with us for the Heard Tell podcast, long form for those of you that are used to the daily radio show. Haven't done one of these in a while. Going to get back to them on a topic that is very important as promised. We don't just talk culture and politics. We talk how culture and politics work. And both of those things are studies of people, how they work, how they govern themselves. That all goes to mental health. And it's a hot topic for the last few years. Way back in the beginning, I think the fourth or fifth show we ever did was with Dr. Kathryn Gordon, mental health. It is still one of the top 5 listened to podcasts we've ever done. So long past overdue to touch back in and run back with Dr. Kathryn Gordon, who I'm going to call Katie the rest of the day because I will mess up and say that name wrong. Dr. Katie, how are you, ma'am? Thank you for joining us.
I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me back on.
I love having you on because you do what we always like to do. We talk about these really hard, complex things, but you do it in a plain language way. You use a lot of pop culture, which we'll get to a little bit later on. But let's start here with some nomenclature. I think we blow by it and we use buzzwords a lot. So I want to make sure we don't do that because we have time to dig into it today. But when we're talking about mental health, we just say that term, but that's a wide, all-encompassing term for a whole lot of different things, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think people mean different things by it. And I think it's usually helpful in a way people contrast it to physical health, although most of us know how interconnected those things are. When we have anxiety, it certainly affects us physically. When we're feeling depressed, we can feel physically in pain or fatigued and all of those things. So mental health generally is looking at our thoughts and emotions and general well-being, satisfaction with life, our outlook on life, how we feel about ourselves and others.
And we hear so much about it. We hear about removing the stigma. Where's the stigma come from? Because we know people are mean and people make fun of people, but that's not what we're really talking about with stigma, is it? Because it goes beyond just a teasing or a joking around or humor. When a mental health professional or when commentators like me are talking about we need to remove the stigma to mental health, what are they really saying there in plain language?
I think that it's the shame that can come from oneself or from other people, the idea that mental health problems are things people just need to snap out of, or that it means there's something wrong with the person for struggling. I think this has improved over time. There's still more to go, but I think there's a lot more understanding of that mental health problems are not the fault of the person who is struggling with them. I think more people get that now than in the past.
One thing we talked about with the COVID-19 pandemic was this is kind of a unique thing in history where pretty much everybody on the planet had to deal with the same thing at the same time. That's really unusual. And I understand there was waves and things like that, but for the most part, everybody was dealing with this at the same time. As a psychologist, as somebody that studies human behavior, I got to think that's kind of a unique event where everybody has the same stressor at the same time. That doesn't happen a lot. What have we learned from that? Because that's a heck of a control group for a scientist, isn't it?
Yeah, it is really something that I would say as I do therapy often comes up in most of our sessions. We kind of talk about if someone was sick, if someone had to miss work, relatives that have been ill. So it's kind of, I've never had where most therapy sessions have one topic that's common across people. I think one of the things that we've learned from it is that people have responded really differently to it. Although I think most people have been stressed in one way or another, there are some people who if they have, for example, less flexibility at work or less support, they tend to be more isolated. They might be struggling more. And so I think even though it's one shared commonality, and in one way, I think that can make people feel less isolated and more connected, you can also see how different the impact is depending on individual circumstances.
How much does isolation play into it? Because for a lot of people, the COVID-19 stuff, that was kind of the first time a lot of them in their lives, unless they're, much older, remember like World War II or maybe the 70s gas, they don't remember things like shortages on shelf. They don't remember things like lockdowns where you're not allowed to go somewhere unless you're in like a natural disaster area. This is stressors that a lot of Americans especially just have never faced before. They're not used to stuff like that. What is it about a brand new stressor out of the clear blue sky? Just something as simple as like, no, you can't go to school. No, you can't go to the grocery store, things like this. How bad does that just mess people's minds up? Because it's just starting at the lower level of, well, it's a break in routine, to this just makes people completely melt down because they just can't handle something that different.
It's a great question. I think that a lot of people were feeling pretty resilient at the beginning, especially when the idea was that, okay, once we have vaccines, things are going to more or less return to normal. And I think as it's persisted, in my observation, I think it's been harder for people because they're starting to forget what does quote unquote normal mean and how long is this going to go on. And so I think that's been difficult. And while some people have gone back to seeing people as much as they did before, the reality is that there are always these extra fears of people getting sick or things spreading or just other types of impact. And it's interesting how much that changes geographically depending on where you are. In North Dakota, there aren't, in the beginning of the pandemic, there were more restrictions, capacities at restaurants. They stopped sports, things like that. And now pretty much there is none of that. So I think that all shapes people's perspective in isolation as well. But I would definitely say that the more it persists for a lot of people, it's been harder for them.
Let's go through some demographics here.
Mm-hmm.
Let's start with the kids. Just on a common sense level, I'm not a scientist. I can read numbers, I can read data. Mm-hmm. But as a parent, just common sense level, if you interrupt 2 years, I know my kids were home out of school 18 months almost, just to have like 14, 15 months total. That's solid. They didn't do the back and forth. There is no way you can throw that kind of disruption into childhood development and not have some kind of an after effect. How long is it going to be before we know that effect? Like scientifically, I don't think we know the full effect in the data, but you've already been seeing it. We know the numbers are through the roof of people seeking things like therapy and counseling. We've seen the behavior numbers in school. Is this something that's going to take a long time to really get our arms around what we just did? And I understand we kind of had to, so I get it. Is it going to be a long time before we get our hands around what we did to this generation of children with this COVID pandemic?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's hard to even think about the after time as we still continue to go through the pandemic. But I and many mental health professionals and parents, like you said, just at a common sense level, are concerned about the impact on kids having their activities disrupted. I mean, even the ones where the schools have stayed pretty much open, there are just factors of teachers being absent because they're sick, or faculty and staff, or their friends being sick, and all of that stuff. And all of that uncertainty is difficult for kids who really thrive on routine and having regular expectations with regard to school. And that's another thing that understandably people were trying to adjust school back and forth depending on what the rates were, but even that can be really difficult on kids. And then seeing their parents stressed is difficult too. And so I am concerned about the long-term impact this is going to have on kids, and I think that we really need to have a lot of care available for them as they get older.
What are we looking for, like, going forward? Because let's just picking a demographic here, because kids are more resilient than we give them credit for in a lot of ways. We don't want to blow anything off, but they are. We're parents. We understand we freak out a lot more than they do, and they're fine sometimes. And sometimes it's the opposite. They freak out and we don't understand why. So what are you looking for from these age groups? Adolescents moving into teens, teens moving into adults. What's some of the kind of indicators or mile markers or whatever you want to call it? You tell me the terminology here. What are we looking for that we should be maybe paying attention to, concerned about, or watching out for as these different demographic age groups start advancing and trying to, even in their own minds, figure out what it is they just lived through?
I think one of the things that I am concerned about and is worth looking for is a general outlook on life in terms of, do they have hope for the future? I think that one of the things that's been difficult through the pandemic is kind of getting hopes up that things are getting better, and then there's a new wave and there's a new strain. And in addition to that, kids might have various feelings about how their government leadership, their school leadership are handling things. And I think that can start to make them question the world as a place that they can count on to be running smoothly, for them to get what they need. And so I think it's important to check in with them about what reasons they have for hope. How are they feeling connected with their friends? What do they think about in terms of their future? How has that been impacted? And so it's kind of a general worldview and their meaning in life, and how is that being impacted by all of this, and talking to them about that.
This is the story of the one. As head of maintenance at a concert hall, he knows the show must always go on. That's why he works behind the scenes, ensuring every light is working, the HVAC is humming, and his facility shines. With Grainger's supplies and solutions for every challenge he faces, plus 24/7 customer support, his venue never misses a beat. Call quickgrainger.com or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Dr. Kathryn Gordon. See, I said it right that time. Clinical psychologist. Let's go with a little bit of an older group. We've got all kinds of data from the Great Recession, 2008, 2009, that the college age young adult demographic, that greatly changed their cultural perspective, that greatly changed their political. There was movement in their political views because they went through that financial crisis right as they were trying to enter the job market and buy homes and these sorts of things. What about the college age and young adult demographic? I'm one of those. Our oldest graduated college March of 2020. That was a great time to try to get graduated out of college. What about that demographic group? Because they're adults now. They're trying to enter the workforce. They're trying to kind of find their way in the world, and they have that during their college years, which is another one of those really important developmental times.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the things that I've observed and interacting with college students is feeling some loss if they've had college during the pandemic, where the classes aren't the way they thought they were going to be. The experiences, the social experiences, which of course is a huge part of college, are different than they had hoped. And so I think we do see higher rates of anxiety and depression and less engagement in some of the college students that are struggling. And so I think that it's really important to recognize that, validate that those are understandable concerns, and then provide tools for managing mental health, for thinking about things, connecting, finding meaning, having friendships, finding ways to look forward and have hope. I think those tools are really important, and often they need guidance with it.
Yeah, and that age group, they're very online. They have a lot of their relationships already online. I know I noticed with my younger children, they didn't really miss a beat talking to their friends because they all talk on social media anyway, TikTok and gaming and these sorts of things. Let's talk about a demographic that does not have that. We've seen the numbers. They call it the Great Resignation. Older Americans, a lot of them during the pandemic said, heck with this, I'm going to the house. They retired early. They're not working as much. Older people are not working the part-time jobs they used to. What about the older Americans and their kind of situation? Because some of them are not as online. So it hits them even harder when you have the isolation effects like a pandemic, like uncertainty economically, things like this. What about them?
Yeah, I think that for some people, resigning, that could be a good thing. Maybe they have more time to spend with their family and more time to take up with some of their hobbies. But one thing that I think is taken for granted sometimes is that we need to interact with people. We need to have relationships with people. It is essential to our health. And I think that it can kind of fall on the back burner and get ignored and lead to a lot of loneliness. So it actually takes a lot of intentional effort, especially if you're not regularly going to a workplace, you're not regularly interacting online. And so it's important to find those times to make phone calls, to go to places, go to church, whatever it is, and have those activities that keep us connected to one another and not kind of let it fall as less of a priority than physical health.
Yeah. And on that note, what is the issue with access? I know we talk about mental health, but we seem to have, before you even get into the services of mental health, is it the bum rush of people that are having mental health crises right now? Is it all those, we know the adolescent system is just absolutely flooded right now. Why is access such a problem right now? Because that seems like it's not even a systemic issue with healthcare that we're already talking about. You can't get an appointment if you want one. What is going on with the access to care since you brought it up?
There are only so many mental health professionals out there. And so when the need gets that high, it can really just exceed the ability to meet all of those needs. I think that that's especially true in areas that are more sparsely populated, where I live in North Dakota. There are some rural areas where there aren't that many therapists. And when the demand is that much higher, it just makes it more difficult to get in. I think that this is part of the reason that it's so important to take preventative measures with mental health so that it's not waiting until people are in a crisis to get in. And I think that that's something that some of the financial assistance, for example, especially that existed in the beginning of the pandemic, I think probably helped people's mental health early on because they had fewer stressors worrying about being able to pay for things that they need. And so that can kind of prevent it from getting to the point where many more people are in crisis and all at once trying to seek care.
Yeah, talking to Dr. Kathryn Gordon. The one perspective on this is that the access to care issue is a professional level one. The other one is that it's a systemic one. Now I'm usually on policy problems like this. I'm usually an all of the above guy. Like, hey, there's probably multiple ways we need to address this. But since you are a provider, which is the pressing need here? Is it the system isn't set up correctly, or is it we've just got to get more providers first because we don't even know how to set up a system if you're this shorthanded?
I'm an all of the above person too. I think that we need more providers, but I also think that there need to be ways that make it easier for people to access mental health care. I mean, the having telehealth and video visits for therapy has been one thing that has been hugely advanced during the pandemic, more insurance coverage for video visits and phone calls, and that has helped access. So that's one example. We still need more, but that I would like to see sustained kind of permanently because that has allowed many more people to access care. Now,
talk about that in a practical way because you are a provider. You're on that end of it. It's a calling, but it's also a business. Let's all be adults here. Almost everybody, even elderly folks now, everybody's got a cell phone. So just common sense wise, you're thinking, if you got a cell phone, you should be able to get a mental health appointment pretty quickly. What's the obstacles from the business side of it and the provider side of it? We know the insurance is Byzantine and that sort of thing, but what do you see as a provider as barriers that we can maybe work at, either regulatory wise or technology wise? Because it seems like everybody's got the technology now. Everybody's got a phone in their hand. So they should be able to get somebody on the line somewhere in the world. What's the preventatives? What's the barriers?
I think, like you said, the big thing is insurance coverage. When insurance covers it, most people can make it work, even if it's just a phone call. I think it's harder for children and probably people with certain mental health needs, where it is more important that they're seen in person. It's harder to stay engaged on a phone for many children and for some people. And so I do meet with people in person and also do telehealth, and having both of those options has been helpful depending on what the person needs. But I think that being able to pay for it is been the main thing that has come up, is being able for people to have coverage for it. That's been the big thing. From a provider standpoint, I have had no I mean, there are technical issues sometimes, but the phone almost always works. And so as long as that's covered for the patient, then that's very workable.
Is it is and I understand there's people like on the spectrum that have trouble with that. There's children, like you mentioned, elderly people may not even a simple smartphone, they may not be technologically savvy with it. But especially when we start talking about, again, there's a spectrum to this, like crisis care, like that initial, I know we've had you on the show, you've talked about suicide, you've written a book about suicide that we'll talk about later. You talk about like, man, sometimes it just takes that 5 seconds for somebody to be able to contact somebody. It seems to me the critical care stuff of at least getting that initial, hey, we don't have anybody right now, but can you make it 2 weeks? Can you do, it seems like that could be a bridge gap here of some type of, you can call somebody somewhere and get somebody on the phone line, and it would make a huge practical and immediate difference to the mental health care crisis.
I agree with that. I work in a medical setting, and so often there are nurses who can contact and just make contact, and they're wonderful. They're empathic. They can help with problem solving. They can connect with community resources, and that way people don't feel like they're alone as they wait to get into care.
Yeah, and I'm a VA patient, so I know the VA. There's a lot of things the VA does bad. I bang on them all the time. One thing they did good now is your healthcare. You have secure messaging directly to your providers through the VA website now. I cannot tell you what a huge difference that is, because so often you just can't get somebody on the phone for a 30-second question. Now I can send them a message to my different care providers, and you'll at least get a response. You may not get the answer because it's still the VA, but at least you get a hold of somebody. Is that something that's going to be scalable to the medical community at large? I know there's privacy concerns and stuff, but it seems like we are not adequately using technology, especially in mental health, where there's privacy concerns, but that the privacy issues with doing technology from your own home, from your own, that's an area where a lot of people mental health wise might actually be more comfortable than actually going in, isn't it?
I think that's right. I think that and the healthcare system that I work in now has my chart, which a lot of systems have. And so patients are able to securely directly message me, which is better than email. I think a lot of providers use email or other types of things like that. My chart is more secure, and security is extremely important when it comes to mental health care and private information. But I agree. I think that's been a big deal, because if patient wants to just ask me something or tell me one quick thing, I can directly receive that. And that helps, especially sometimes the way that people manage wait lists for therapy is to see people every other week instead of every week. And that way you can see more patients. So being able to have that message option in the meantime is definitely helpful.
We've been talking about patient mental health a lot. How's the providers holding up? Like, we don't stop and talk about that, but we already have a shortage of them. We've seen, I know the frontline healthcare workers for, like, the ERs and things, they've gotten a lot of it. I've got to imagine the flip side of the mental health crisis is our providers have got to be stressed. They've got to be having their own mental health crises with this. How's the providers holding up? Because if we lose them, then the rest of this ain't going to matter a whole lot. So, how y'all doing? Are you okay?
I'm really glad you asked that. In talking to other mental health providers, I think that a lot of us many of us go to therapy ourselves to make sure that we're doing okay and that we can do our jobs, but it's also unique in that we're going through the same kind of events as our patients are during this time. And I think that can help us connect with patients, but it can also make it difficult because there's not that distance when we're talking about coping with something. There are often things that we're trying to cope with our own concerns about our children, about the long-term effects, about isolation. And so I think that it has been wearing and difficult. And I think that some people have reduced their caseloads or, have done things like that, because I will say, at least in our training, something that is really important is that we are trained very well to pay attention to our levels of mental health and well-being, and to make sure that we're taking care of it so that we can provide good care. And so that's not always easy to do in practice. For example, if a lot of people want to get in and be seen, it's hard to say, no, I can't see you, and keep our caseload manageable. So it's a struggle. I think that the biggest support has just been able to talk to other mental health professionals about how we're managing and check in on each other.
Yeah, we're talking to Dr. Katie Gordon about mental health on her tel. Going to take a quick break. When we come back, she has written a book on suicide prevention, a workbook. When we last talked to her, it was getting ready to come out. Now it's been out. So we get to do a little bit of review how that's gone. Also going to continue to talk about the mental health care system, talk about access to care. And we'll get into one of her favorite topics, using pop culture to talk about healthcare, good examples in media. It's been a while since we talked, so hopefully she's got some new ones for us. Dr. Katie Gordon, more with her on her tel right after this. Welcome back to Her Tel. We're talking to Dr. Kathryn Gordon, clinical psychologist, friend of the program, one of the OGs. She was one of the first episodes we ever did. Glad to finally have her back. Let's talk suicide for a minute. We had a very high-profile suicide in the news this past week. Former Miss USA, on paper, law degree, MBA from Wake Forest, had a TV gig, was living in New York City. Seemed to have everything. Beautiful young woman, only 30 years old. And although they're still doing an investigation, the authorities feel pretty confident this was a suicide, jumped off a building. This is just another example, isn't it, of you just never know with somebody what's going on in their head, no matter how successful, no matter what's going on. And suicide can kind of strike people from just out of nowhere, can it?
Absolutely. It is so heartbreaking. And I saw this statement by her mother, who said that she, even as close as they were, had just recently learned how bad her depression was, that she was struggling.
What do you do? I've asked you this question before, but where do you get involved with somebody? Where's the line? Because everybody's sad. We just talked about, everybody's stressed. Everybody has anxieties from COVID or work or whatever. Where do you actually start worrying about, okay, do I need to call somebody? Okay, do I need to leave this person alone? Give folks just a couple practical things, because you don't ever want to be overbearing, and people can feel intrusive doing that, especially to a loved one or a stranger. But when do you need to just kind of set aside that person's feelings and be like, okay, I need to call somebody. I need to get them seen. This person doesn't need to be left alone, that sort of thing.
It's a great question. And one thing that I want to say first is that I think that sometimes when people weren't able to step in or stop someone from dying by suicide, they blame themselves. And so I'm going to give suggestions for what we can do and what we can try to do. But I also want to be clear that sometimes we just don't see it. We don't know how much someone is struggling. And sometimes we can try to intervene and we aren't able to effectively do that. So if you've had that happen, I think about this young woman's mom and her blaming herself for not seeing it. And I think it's important to recognize the limits of what we can do. That being said, we are all capable of reaching people who are open to it. And so if you see changes in someone, if you observe changes, even if they're not saying they're depressed or they're sad, but they just sound like they're feeling more hopeless, or they feel like they seems like they're not enjoying life, they're withdrawing from activities and people that they used to love, then it's always good to open up and check in with them. I'm a big proponent of being direct, asking, are you having thoughts about suicide? Are you doing okay? And the research suggests that asking directly does not plant the idea in people's head, but it can open a conversation. And the person might say, no, I'm not, but I'm struggling. Or they might say, yeah, I am, and talk about it. And so those are some of the big factors to look for. Some other things that you tend to see are that can be warning signs, although it varies depending on the person, is if they're having really disrupted sleep, they seem more agitated. So those are all things to look out for and worth checking in. In terms of when to push, if someone kind of doesn't want to talk about it, I think that's it's a difficult question. And one of the things that I try to think about is if I'm really worried about someone and they don't seem like they want to talk to me in particular or want me to help connect them with someone, I might think about some of their loved ones, friends, or family members who I can check in with too. Do you see this too? Are there things we might do together to help this person?
I hate to even give you this question, but this is just the world we live in. When do you get the authorities involved? Like, when would you call a 911? When would you call? I know there's crisis lines as well, but all they can really do is talk to you. But obviously, if there's a physical threat or a weapon or somebody's on the ledge or something like that, but that's almost an outlier. Usually, it's way more subtle than that, isn't it? Well, I hate to just say when in doubt, call somebody and let them make the call, but that's pretty much what you're down to in these situations, isn't it?
This is such an area of controversy because I think that I don't think there are any simple answers. I will say that if someone has, done something to hurt themselves or they're about to and said that, then that is when I personally would want to call the authorities to prevent them from being harmed. I think that if there are other ways, for example, if they're talking about suicide, but there's an opportunity to get them in the emergency room to go over there and those types of things. I mean, it's hard to say. I don't mean to be vague. It's just there are so many different factors that go into it that I think there are other things to do besides call the authorities in a lot of situations. But on the other hand, sometimes that's the thing that can help if someone is imminently going to hurt themselves and you need help.
Yeah. You've talked about when we interviewed you before the book came out, the Suicide Thought Workbook. Have it right here. I did read it. You were nice enough to send me a copy of it. When you're talking about self-help and self-care, because you live in a very rural part of the country up there in the northern Great Plains, when people are just by themselves, is there an effective way to give them some kind of a self-coping tool? Because I know there's no such thing as a cure-all for, there's no Tylenol for suicide prevention. There's not one bullet. But what have you found now? Because you've had about, a year since the book came out, give or take. You've got some feedback and data on it now. Is these tools applicable, and are they working for these people that are isolated, that they can get a book and at least it gets maybe their mind just shifted a lot? We talk in my therapy at PTSD all the time, like, sometimes you just got to shift your mind or physically change your mind. Is it effective?
That's the feedback that I'm getting is, that people find it helpful. Many of them are also in therapy alongside it and don't find it as a replacement. There is something about having a dialogue and conversation that can be helpful, especially when you're struggling. But there are also people who won't go to therapy or can't access it. And so being able to buy a book for $20 that they can do in the privacy of their own home and not worry about being seen, sometimes that's a better fit for them too. And so the idea was to give more options, of the maximal amount of options available. And there are, I have had some positive feedback about it's a workbook. So the idea was to make it close to therapy, where it's not kind of just throwing all this heavy jargon at someone and they have to think about it and have some huge epiphany or revelation. It's very much broken down into step by step. I ask, the workbook asks a question, they fill it in. There are some small steps to take to make things better, but the overall picture of building hope, reducing pain, and connecting. So I've been very grateful for the positive feedback I received from people that either working with their therapist or working with it on their own, that they found it to be helpful.
Talk about the connection of those two, because I've heard you talk about it. You've written about it a lot. You've talked about it on other podcasts. There's a connection between hope and pain. And I don't know how direct a line that is, but people in pain lose hope, and people with hope can cope with the mental ability to handle pain and loss and challenges. If you can hold on to hope, is something beyond what science can, I think you'd agree with this, beyond what science can explain. Why are those two things so intrinsically connected when it comes to mental health? Because they really seem like, not that this is a perfect seesaw, but if you were going to have one, those would be the two counterweights, wouldn't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right. And most theories of suicide, scientific theories of suicide, do look at pain and hope. A lot of people, when they desire suicide, it's because they want to escape pain. It's not that they want to die, they don't want to exist. It's not that. It's that they're in excruciating pain and they want some relief from it. And hope can be a huge buffer, because even if someone is in deep pain, if they feel there's any chance of it lifting and things improving in the future, they can hold on and say, okay, I'm in pain now, but if it's going to improve, I can wait through this. I don't need to end my life. And so that's how they're related. It soothes some of the pain to know that it's not going to be permanently at that excruciating level.
What is it about pain that just completely disrupts our, I don't even know the right term here, so you can help me, but that brain body connection, to use a real cliche term, but what is it about pain that just completely short circuits everything about our thought process and our emotions?
One analogy that I've heard by Dr. David Klonsky, who's a psychologist who wrote the 3-step theory, which I feature in the book, that I thought was a really useful way to compare to pain, is he talked about when you have food poisoning and you're so sick, you can't really think of doing anything else because it's all consuming how terrible you feel. And that's kind of how pain can be when it hurts that bad, that it is physically very difficult to move your attention to other spaces or to imagine feeling better or feeling different. Because if we think about it from like an evolutionary perspective, we're meant to pay attention to pain. It means something's wrong. It means we need to do something to make it better. And so that's why I think it just becomes all encompassing until we learn tools to manage, step back, and alleviate it.
All right, let's lighten the topic up a little bit, because this is always really heavy, talking to Dr. Kathryn Gordon. I love you do this. You do this every time we talk to you, but you love to use pop culture references to talk about mental health. We're talking about some ways to self-care. Part of that is in taking media that portrays mental health in a good way. So give us a couple of the new ones. I know you've wrote about like BoJack Horseman in the past, other shows that have had good, positive, some that kind of surprise folks, but what's a couple you've seen lately? Positive mental health applications in media, in movies and TV shows, whatever the case may be.
The show I've been big on watching lately is Cobra Kai, and hopefully some people are still watching it. I know it gets, let's just say it kind of, I think after the first couple seasons, it's just the karate. Some people tire of that, but I'm still enjoying it. I think there have been some really good mental health depictions in that show. For example, Sam, who is Daniel's daughter, is attacked by Tori, and at first she has flashbacks and panic attacks as a result of that. So you see some realistic depictions of someone after they've experienced trauma, trying to avoid reminders of it, having kind of a physiological startle reaction when seeing the person, having flashbacks, and that impacting her life. So I thought that was a good depiction. I think that Johnny, as the main character, he struggles a lot with alcohol use. And I think that they managed to find a way, even though there are a lot of characteristics about him that people might not like, to find likable or sympathetic, and that you can see how he's kind of feels like a failure. And when he tries, he and doesn't live up, then he tends to turn to alcohol again. And so I think that some of the depictions in there have been pretty good.
Yeah, I find Hollywood to be really ridiculous in a lot of cases. And I know we're doing streaming and it's not all Hollywood anymore, but for lack of a better term, like where we have we have parental ratings about there's smoking in this picture. Like, what? Really? But I think alcohol and to a lesser extent drug use, I think that's something that I've really seen a change in my lifetime. I'm 41. I've really seen a change in how it's portrayed in media. And there's just no way to, another one of those things you just can't split up. You can't talk mental health without people self-medicating, either with alcohol or drugs, or you can even do it with your work, as I've learned. You can work yourself addictively like everything else. Do you see that as well, or am I accurate in that? Do you think that has gotten better in how it's portrayed?
I think so. I think that it's less. I think that there are ways that it's shown kind of less as like a self-control issue and more of that people have a lot of stressors, and one way that they might be prone to dealing with that is through substance use. And one of the things that they have done on Cobra Kai is they show a lot of backstories and show kind of when they didn't learn good mental health coping tools and some of the absence of parental figures in their life. And so I think that kind of context helps to make a more realistic picture of why someone might continue to try to escape the negative emotions they're feeling or the pain they're feeling through alcohol or substance use.
Yeah, and I don't want to give away plot lines on Cobra Kai because my kids love that show. I need it in small doses, but when they took Chris back to Vietnam, I thought that was actually I cringed when my kids said they were going to do it. I was like, uh-oh, here we go. I thought they actually did really well with that. I thought because you have such a just bluntly evil character, and some of it was a little over the top. The military accuracy wasn't there, but as far as explaining how somebody becomes evil, and I hate to use that term, but he's the bad guy in the movie.
Mm-hmm.
I actually thought they did pretty well with that, all things considered.
Well, that's good to hear from someone with a military background, kind of that you felt that there was some accuracy to it.
Yeah, I get the, evil person puts you in an evil environment and you become evil to survive. That's a classic, what's the term? Coping skill, I guess. But that's just human nature 101 stuff. And if you're going to tell a story like that and talk about mental health, this is all human behavior 101 stuff. And we always talk about on our show, human nature is undefeated. You just got to try to learn to get some wins where you can, right? Mm-hmm. Dr. Katie Gordon, we so appreciate talking to you. We talked about the book a little bit, so you talk about it. Tell us about the workbook. You also do other media. You do podcasting. You do some writing. We'd love to have you back at Ordinary Times anytime you want to write about Cobra Kai or anything else. Again, you got an open invitation. Let folks know where you're at, where you're writing, what you're doing.
Sure. Well, you can, lately what I've been working mostly on is my podcast, which is called Psychodrama Podcast. And I co-host with another psychologist. We tend to talk about societal controversies, mental health, psychological issues. And we really try to talk about things with some care and expertise and look at different facets of the issue. And I like podcasting for that because I think that when people talk, you can kind of hear more versus, I don't know, tweet arguments or something like that. So that's the main thing I've been working on.
Was that a shot at me? You kind of looked at me and said,
no. Not at all. I don't see you in a ton of Twitter fights, but no, I think that was praise to you for your podcast.
Good recovery. Good recovery. Anyway, tell them about your social media and your podcast.
I am on Twitter at Dr. Kathryn Gordon, DrKathryn It's the same on Instagram. And you can listen to Psychodrama Podcast on most podcast platforms. I also write, although I have been writing less just for the sake of time. I do sometimes write for Psychology Today, but you can find links to the stuff I've written on my website, kathrynhgordon.com.
And you do great work, and we appreciate you greatly. this stuff isn't going to go away, and we're not going to stop talking about it, because we don't want to diagnose people, but so much of what we see in culture and politics on social media and how politics is covered, I think a lot of it, if you understand how people are thinking, how people are coping, people's mental health, I think you start explaining a lot of things that the politics don't. Because I've learned in what I've been doing the last 3 or 4 years with, politics is usually just the coat you're putting on, and your cultural tribes are kind of the coat you put on. And the stuff that's underneath it is where you can really get to the story. And you probably have big fancy scientific words for that phenomenon, but everything we do is about people. And if we study people, you've got to talk mental health. So you use the fancy scientific words for that, but that's where I'm at on it.
I really appreciate our conversations. And one of the most important things to me as a psychologist and having these discussions is moving away from the big fancy words and making it accessible so that people can use it in their daily lives, that it's not just restricted to psychologists.
Yep. Plus us hillbillies, we have trouble with them big words sometimes. So I appreciate that greatly. So Dr. Kathryn Gordon, who can explain it to us in an academic setting and also explain it to us like we're 5, we greatly appreciate you, ma'am. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me on.
You will be back, I promise. So
absolutely.
Take care. Folks, if you've listened to the Heard Tell program, you've heard our friend Gabriella Hoffman, but you need to make sure you're checking out her podcast, District of Conservation. It's a podcast exploring the nuances of true conservation efforts from DC and beyond. From topic discussions to exclusive interviews with conservation and energy newsmakers, Gabriella keeps listeners appraised of the latest news stories while elevating important voices. Listen to the District of Conservation on Apple Podcasts or wherever podcasts are played. We are going to talk about mental health on this program, both on Heard Tell, the long form, and on the radio show, the Daily Show. It's too important not to. So much of what we do is just based on our own human behaviors, and we excuse it off with other things. But if we don't take care of our own mental health, and we don't take care of each other's mental health, and we don't care about each other's mental health, a lot of this other stuff we're talking about just isn't mattering as much. We want to gloss over things and stay busy without dealing with these underlying problems. We're not going to do that. Our culture has major problems in it. And a lot of those problems are we're not taking care of ourselves and we're not taking care of each other. It's something we're going to work on. It's something we're going to talk about. We're going to have experts on like Dr. Katie Gordon and others. We want to give you tools to actually affect this in your own life, taking care of people around you, what to watch for, danger signs, but also positive pop culture media. The reason we talk about those TV shows and movies with her is because if you have somebody that you're having trouble getting into a mental health conversation with them, you can watch a show with them and get into it sideways that way. It makes you a nice easy, lets the show do the heavy lifting, and then all you got to do is talk to the person that you care about. Kind of makes it easy. We want to do practical things on our programs. It's not just buzzwords and ethereal theory and things that somebody somewhere else needs to do something about. This is a practical matter that you need to practically apply to your life. It's important. We want to do that, and we'll continue to talk about it on Heard Tell. That'll do it for this episode of the Heard Tell podcast. The Heard Tell Daily Show every weekday for about an hour on the YouTube channel. If you want to watch it, all the podcasting platforms, Big Talker FM is streaming it. You can do it on their Listen Live tab on their app from the App Store. Also their Facebook page, Big Talker FM on Facebook. You can watch it there. It's on at 6 a.m. in the mornings, 3 p.m. in the evenings. We have great content every day trying to turn down the noise of the news cycle, kind of hit some of the headlines. We talk about things that matter. We don't talk about things that don't matter, and there's just caterwauling noise. We don't spend time with that because the most precious thing you give us is your time. We want to respect it. We don't want to talk about things that don't matter. We don't want to waste your time on us being silly. So we try to respect you by doing the best we can with it. We'd sure appreciate you subscribing on whatever platform works best for you. Also leave a comment and rating. We sure appreciate it. If you have something you want to convey to us, if you got a comment, an epistle, whatever it may be, You got a topic you want covered. You got a guest you think we should talk to. Let us know. heardtellshow@gmail.com. You can email us at heardtellshow on the Twitter. You can direct message us that way. My Twitter handle, 4 for the Fire, you can message me there. We'd love to hear from you. We've already done some topics on the shows based off of what listeners have asked us to cover. We'd love to do so again. Love to get your feedback. If you would do us a real big solid, though, share us on your social media. All those platforms have a share button. Let people know where they can find Heard Tell. We'll keep doing it as long as you keep listening. So happy to have these long form podcasts back up and going. We'll be digging into these issues. These will come out on the weekends, Monday through Friday. We'll see you here for the Heard Tell Daily Show with a great guest every day and the topics of the day. We appreciate you so much. Thank you. None of this works without you. We wouldn't have anybody to talk to. You're the most important part of what we do. So wherever you and yours are across the street or around the world, we hope you're well. We hope you are well fed. And we'll see you next time for Heard Tell.
All the music on Heard Tell is provided under a Creative Content license from monstercat.com.
This is the story of the one. As a maintenance engineer, he hears things differently. To the untrained ear, everything on his shop floor might sound fine, but he can hear gears grinding or a belt slipping. So he steps in to fix the problem at hand before it gets out of hand. And he knows Grainger's got the right product he needs to get the job done, which is music to his ears. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.